Hello everybody to Unsolved, and what we're trying to do is find the person responsible for murdering JonBenet Ramsey, a 6-year-old girl that was in kindergarten during her Christmas break from school on Christmas Day. No one has been held responsible. No one has been able to solve this case. So in this episode, it's broken into 2 parts. First part is a scenario of what happened, and then the second part is a look at the neighbors of JonBenet Ramsey. Now, the way that I understand it is a Ramsey neighbor on 14th Street who shares the back alley with the Ramsey house. That neighbor walked up and down this alleyway, and he knew about the window wells and the grating and the basement. And so one night, or one dark night, he looked over there and he could see light coming from the basement. And so he could look straight down into the Ramsey's basement and knew that he would be able to enter their house through that grating because there was no lock on it. And he spoke with Michael, and they decided that they were going to kidnap JonBenet on Christmas night. And so, working together, one was able to hold open the grating and the other go down into the basement, and then he went down and followed him into the basement. And then they went up to the kitchen area where they split up, and Michael wrote the ransom note, and it took him nearly 30 minutes to write the ransom note with the pen there in the kitchen and the notepad. And Stephen went up to JonBenet's room and got her out of her bed, picked her up, and took her down to the basement. And he was down in the basement with JonBenet while Michael was working on the ransom note. And then when Michael was done with the ransom note, he placed it on the bottom step for whoever came down in the morning to find. And then when Michael finally went down to the basement, he found that Stephen had murdered JonBenet by strangling her with a garrote, and he wasn't happy about it. And he's the one that cleaned her up, put her in the white blanket, and placed her in the wine cellar. And then they both exited the Ramsey's house by placing that suitcase up flush against the wall. Fleet White's the one that moved it at an angle to the wall. But it was put flush to the wall, and one of them exited out through the window well, and then the other one exited out through the window well, and one of them placed the grating back down, and then they left. And John Ramsey tells us that he found that suitcase under the basement window, that was unusual, that was odd, that it didn't belong there, because he had placed the suitcase down in the basement just a few days before, and he didn't place it over there by that window. So what we're looking at here is a map of where Ramsey's house was located on 15th Street. So on this video, I'm looking at all the neighbors of John Ramsey that shared that back alleyway that lived on 14th Street. And so we're just going to start at the top, the north, and work our way down. Now I believe the murderer of JonBenet Ramsey was a male. So I'm going to focus only on the men that lived in these houses. Now the first man that I looked at was Russell Hullett. And I searched the internet and looked in different articles and stuff about him. Here's what he looks like. And then these photographs, some of them were taken much later after JonBenet's death. A few were before. And I couldn't find anything that made him stick out. So on to the next man, David Denke. He lived at 776 14th Street in the second house down, very close to the Ramsey's house. And he was into homotherapy. I don't know if it's homotherapy. And here's a photograph of him from the newspaper. That was the best that I could find. And I didn't find anything that stood out about him. And then the next man was Kenneth Smith, and he learned. And then the next man is Mike Mason Pierre, and you could argue that his house was the closest to that back door of the Ramsey's house and where the grating was. And I looked into him and I couldn't find anything suspicious about him, and so I rule him out. Now the next house belonged to Stephen Colby, and I did an episode on him, and he had 3 boys. The youngest I think was around Burke's age, and then they were a couple years older. And they were over there on Christmas Day at the Ramseys. And there's not a lot of suspicion about him. I didn't find anything alarming about Steve Colby doing searches. Now, when I created an earlier episode about these neighbors, I just wrote Stanley, and I was completely unable to find out if that's his first or last name or anything about him. So, couldn't find anything there. And okay, the last man in the house on the street, on 14th Street, is Stephen Sultan. And here's a photograph of him. And he grew up in Downey, California, in Southern California. And he lived at that Boulder address just around the time JonBenet was murdered. And just looking through the internet and searching records about him, I found this voter registration listing, and you can see his address is in Longmont. This is after he moved away from 14th Street. And I noticed this at the bottom, Zoe Helgoff. And I was thinking, I know that name. And so I looked up on the internet, and I found out that her mom is Linda Helgoff. And so I'm going to explain a little bit about the family. Real quickly now, Harold and Catherine Helgoff moved to Boulder in the 40s, and they were farmers, and then they started a auto salvage lot. And they had a lot of children, and their first child, Richard, and their third child, Doug, worked at this salvage yard. And their youngest daughter was Linda Helgoff, the one that lived by Stephen. And one of the children of those people is Michael Helgoff, and he's a suspect in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. And he had high-tech boots, and he had a stun gun, and he killed himself when it seemed like the police were zeroing in on him. Oh, and I almost forgot this last thing here. Stephen Jeffrey Sultan, registered sex offender. And he's on the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. And he was convicted in Los Angeles County of lewd acts with a child under age 14. And that conviction was on September 13th, 1982. And he served time in jail for that. Not sure when he got out of jail, but you can see from this here that he lived in Bellflower, California in 1991, and then he lived in Los Angeles at 1768 Midvale Road in 1995. And then I found this, that he moved to Denver, and he lived there in 1995. And sometime after this, he moved to 14th Street, sharing the alleyway with the Ramseys. Now, I know from creating a video of all the people tested, their DNA tested, Stephen Jeffrey Sultan was not tested. He's unfamiliar to the police as far as I know. And so he could be that unknown male DNA. Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved. And do you think this might be the unknown killer of JonBenet Ramsey, and the police never checked him out? And Nancy Drew is the first one to point this person out?